The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has today announced a radical shake-up of asylum rules and a crackdown on people crossing the channel illegally. Because that's what you need when you're fleeing war, rape and persecution, to be shaken up and cracked down on. It seems that she has failed to learn the most practical lesson of the last year, emerging, gleaming, both from Brexit and the lockdown, that there is no way to lock others out that doesn't also lock you in. Minnie, can you sum up the new proposals for us? Feel free to swear.
Where do I even start? I will try and make it as simple as possible, because what she has actually proposed is a massive and misdirected overhaul of the asylum system. So obviously no one wants people to risk their lives crossing the channel or spend years and years stuck in the system once they're in the UK. But to fix that, you need a system which starts from the premise that refugees should and might need to come to the UK. What Patel is trying to do is roll back the Refugee Convention by saying that the method of arrival into the UK will determine whether or not you have a legitimate asylum claim. She's trying to make it impossible to claim asylum if you've come through another country first. And as we're a fucking island, that would mean the majority of asylum seekers would be denied.
So you can't apply until you're here, and you can't get... If you get here and apply, then you'll be refused anyway. So on the margins, one of the possible results will be that someone fleeing genuine danger might be deported nevertheless, because we don't like the way they fled danger.
Exactly. So, this system will not work for the majority of asylum seekers, and it particularly will not work for the people already stuck in Europe or in France, or who do make it to Europe. And for those people, it will massively increase the reliance on people smugglers and traffickers, because there will be absolutely no other way to get to the UK. It's actually a very, very dangerous proposal. And also there are real questions about whether or not it's legal.
Yeah. So, okay, let's take this in sort of blocks. First of all, I know we see and hear a lot more about it, but are asylum applications actually on the rise?
No. Absolutely not. The complete opposite. So asylum applications are actually currently at their lowest since 2002. But what has massively increased since the Tories came into power is the number of people waiting in the UK for a decision on their case. So actually, the only thing that is actually on the rise is the Home Office's incapability of handling immigration cases. Now, part of that is to do with the fact that the government has continually layered chaotic policy on top of chaotic policy. And when you do that, you make it really impossible to make clear and coherent decisions and to get people the support they need. I mean, there's currently around 40,000 asylum seekers in the UK who have been here for years. We see this at JCWI all the time. 5 years, 10 years waiting for a decision, and they really do have valid, or if you want to call it so-called legitimate claims. And that whole time, they could have been living here with their friends and family. They could have been working. They could have been valued, important members of our communities. And actually, this plan will increase the number of people left in limbo, because we haven't got anywhere to send them in this kind of boomerang 24-hour proposal that she's suggesting. And what I think is really important to remember is we've already seen Priti Patel move towards a camp or barracks US style model. And if this plan goes ahead, we can expect to see more camps like that on British soil.
Okay, so next bit. Is it illegal to cross the channel in search of asylum? And is there any basis to the notion that a refugee has to apply in the first safe country they land?
No. I literally cannot.
No and no.
No and no. It is absolutely legal to cross the channel and seek asylum. And also the majority of asylum seekers do claim asylum elsewhere. It's such a tiny, tiny proportion of people who want or need to come to the UK. There is nothing in any international law that says you have to apply in the first safe country. I think Where the confusion arises is actually through the Dublin Convention, which we are no longer part of. And what that convention said was that people could be returned to the first country that they were recorded in. Now, if you look at the history of that convention, it came out of a need to determine which EU country had responsibility for someone. So it came from wanting to take responsibility. And there is actually a hierarchy of how EU countries make that decision.
Yeah.
Top of that list is that someone has family somewhere else in the UK, in the EU, and therefore should be allowed to join them. But the UK only ever participated in the returns aspect. Again, this does not make it illegal to travel to a different country, but it does allow for unfair returns. And actually, interestingly, the government is now trying to convince the EU, which we have just left, that we should continue to take part in that system. Yes. But there is absolutely no incentive from the EU to say yes, and they're basing their entire proposal on these third country agreements.
Naomi, precisely in this point, Professor Simon Usherwood wrote that this sort of proposal is a sort of natural extension of the take back control fallacy. The notion that by having autonomy over your rules, you don't need others to play ball. I mean, that fails the instant it comes into contact with reality, doesn't
it? Completely. I mean, how can you return asylum seekers unless you have a network of agreements with the places that you want them to go to? Unless, and I wouldn't put it past her, she's proposing dumping them out of a plane at 10,000 feet with a parachute strapped to their backs, if they're lucky.
Oh, my goodness. Now, the Dublin Accord, of course, did allow the UK to do just that.
Of course it did.
But we're no longer part of it because we're no longer part of the EU. So is this simply another in a long line of attempts to replicate the bits of the EU membership that we liked without, actual membership?
Yes, because there's no choice. When it's rolling over trade deals with third-party countries outside of the EU that we previously had a trade deal with by virtue of our EU membership, or this, it is all about this kind of pound shop version. They're either exactly the same as what we had, or actually not quite as good. And I fear with this, it end up not being quite as good, and it takes time and it's inefficient, and it's just endlessly frustrating that we're having to now reinvent the wheel with it. But you're totally right. Of course, the Dublin Accords did allow for exactly what she's proposing, and this is absolute red meat for the worst kinds of devoted libertarian-y type voters that they're worried about keeping on side, and it's absolutely revolting.
Yeah, so Nitin, on that, is this just a sort of xenophobic dog whistle by the Conservatives to their base just ahead of a local election? I mean, is it simply a modern version of Michael Howard's "Are you thinking what we're thinking"?
I think 100%. I mean, the fact is that you had Priti Patel justifying, her draconian laws or her proposals by saying that she wanted to save these people from the evil traffickers and so on. But then at the same time, she's now saying that they will be indefinitely liable for removal at any time from the UK. So clearly she doesn't care about them at all in any way. And so my whole point is this is all about trying to appease her kind of xenophobic nationalist support across the country. And I think that's also, I mean, I had the impression that to actually apply for asylum, that you had to be in the country that you wanted to claim asylum from.
Yes, you're absolutely allowed to basically choose where you want to apply for asylum.
So I kind of think the idea of an illegal, the word illegal just seems to be constantly used to stigmatize rather than any informed way at all. And then you've got her clandestine, what was his name? Clandestine channel threat commander or something, channel threat commander, I think it is. And it's like, it seems like it's all parody upon parody, but unfortunately this is reality. It's impossible to parody it.
All right, but here's the difficult bit, okay? If this is intended as a dog whistle, is the righteous outrage of progressives like us its amplifier? Do you know what I mean? Every time I call Priti Patel heartless on social media, am I in fact boosting her credentials with the people for whom heartless is a desirable quality in a Home Secretary.
The difficulty is that any kind of form of protest right now, as we all know, is becoming harder to protest in any way at all. So, just literally by objecting to dehumanization and demonization of immigrants, which is a fundamental, that should be problematic for anyone with a conscience. Just by voicing that, it's very difficult because, right now, if we wanted to take to the streets, now they're changing the laws so that we face the possibility of 10 years in jail if we make too much noise or we're too disruptive in expressing our shock at what's going on. So it just feels like at every level it feels like a game of chess where we're constantly being pushed into the corner and unable to kind of really object in any way. So I don't know. It's just very frustrating to watch all this.
Minnie, by claiming her aim is to create safe and legal routes for people to seek asylum in the UK, is the government actually admitting that for decades there have been no such safe and legal routes?
It's classically confused messaging from the Home Office. And I think actually part of the reason that they're using that safe and legal routes language is because in the last few years, as more people have become aware of what's happening in the Channel, especially last summer, and people like me, other campaigners, other organisations were saying to the government, we need more safe and legal routes of entry. It was clearly having cut through with the public. And so the government has kind of taken that on board a little bit. They have admitted that there isn't anything, but they also claim that their existing routes work. So it's classically confused. But I think it's important to remember as well, that this is a historic problem. It's been pointed out that these proposals today don't massively differ from proposals put forward by David Blunkett back in the early 2000s. I think the difference is that now Brexit has created an additional problem. So they've had to create a new narrative around safe and legal routes because not only do they know that the Home Office is inadequate and failing asylum seekers on all counts, they now can't rely on returns to the EU because we don't have that agreement. So focusing this as part of their global Britain strategy, which we all know is a shambles, while simultaneously using asylum seekers and migrants as a scapegoat and a distraction tactic for everything that goes wrong on their watch.
In there's a deeper philosophical point, isn't there? Can you fairly reform any system if your focus is cutting numbers? So if you've already started from the outcome you want, can you look at a thing objectively and say, where does it work? I'm thinking of the parallel with the welfare state, where it's been largely accepted that you can't reform welfare if your aim is to actually cut what you spend on it, because reforming it fairly and objectively might actually result in you paying slightly more money, but a better system. So in the same way, reforming the asylum rules fairly might actually result in more applications, but fewer queues, more humane treatment. If you start from the point of view that I want to cut the numbers, can that ever result in a clear-eyed reform?
No, definitely not. And it also doesn't work for the Home Office. It hasn't worked for the Home Office ever. This was one of the key learnings from the Windrush scandal, which also broke because the government had put in place targets and numbers for how many people could be in the UK. And particularly on asylum, there is no reform which starts from we need to limit the number of people who come here, because that simply is not how refugee crises or asylum seekers' journeys work. And it's also not the spirit in which the UK signed up to the Refugee Convention after the atrocities of World War II. And importantly, you do have to be compassionate, but you also have to be realistic. And I think that's the thing that strikes me the most about these proposals. You have to look at what actually happens to people when they leave their countries for whatever reason and how those journeys take place. It's not as if asylum seekers plan for months on end that they're going to leave and that they're going to know every single available avenue to enter the UK. What she's essentially proposing is that if you flee the Taliban and you don't fill out the online form while you're running away, you're going to be in a two-tier system and you can't rebuild your life in the UK.
I'm laughing because it's gross, it's grotesque, but it's horrific. Naomi, Priti Patel refused repeatedly today in interviews to exclude the possibility of using places like the Isle of Man or Gibraltar as processing centres. Now, those territories have already ruled it out. Why is this standoff being confected, other than the possibility that, faced with the prospect of being sent to the Isle of Man, someone may decide not to flee a war zone?
It may or may not act as some kind of deterrent. Gibraltar isn't the greatest place in the world either. Sure, it's lovely for some people. I'm not a huge fan of it, not least because the monkeys stole all of our packed lunch.
But how will this work if they say no? I mean, Gibraltar has already joined Schengen.
It's typical bombastic bullshit out of this government. It's trying to drum up some vision of some kind of fucking Alcatraz where people will be held and protest. It's designed for that red meat voter base that we've just been talking about, to sort of fixate on this offshore prison where they can be processed and sent back if they've been found to be fraudulent and actually they're just economic migrants trying to make their way in, or whatever effing nonsense they come up with this time. So yeah, it's not workable.
She also repeatedly emphasized that asylum seekers are mostly men who have left behind their women and children, is the way she put it. I must get me some of those. If I'm going to be a real man. Now, earlier this year, the government voted against the Dubs Amendment.
Yes.
How can those two positions be reconciled?
Well, of course they can't. Of course they can't. And obviously, Lord Dubs himself, having been a child that, fled persecution and wanting to offer safe passage for them, and this government, voted against it, whipped against it, and yet now seem to be, criticising asylum seekers for not bringing their women and children with them. It's just horrific. I mean, you can't reconcile them. It's same answer to the previous question. It's more and more and more nonsense.
Yes, they're trolling us.
They're trolling us. It's all part of whipping up their part in the culture war, and even the language around it that gets used. And I often like to talk about, seekers of sanctuary, to try and help people envisage what these people are actually they're trying to seek safety. They're trying to seek sanctuary from all of these, horrendous situations that are happening to them, in much the same way as global issues have to be tackled multilaterally. This is exactly the same thing, because if we don't, they ultimately hurt all of us. No one is safe until everyone is safe is the mantra that we're being told quite rightly by the WHO around vaccines, but the same is going to be true of climate change. If you think mass migration is a problem now, my God, just wait until the global south heats up to even more terrifying levels than we're seeing at the moment, and the flood and famine that come with that. And this environment that we're creating isn't just hostile. I mean, it's just downright disgusting. And to want to go out and be some kind of, world leader, standard bearer with global Britain for the rule of law and, being good citizens. I mean, it's just a nonsense.
Nitin, are there deeper political reasons, do you think, for maintaining this hierarchy of deserving of help versus undeserving of help? We see it weaved through almost every government policy at the moment.
Well, I think it's kind of very nicely. Well, there's a lot of ways in which this has been summed up in during the last year, but I think none so succinctly as when Boris Johnson talked about greed being a good thing. I mean, the idea that and this is the problem really, because ultimately this government has no integrity whatsoever. I mean, they're a corrupt government. They distract us constantly by using archaic kind of symbols of nationalism. We had James Wilde the other day dressing down Tim Davie for not having enough Union Jacks in the annual report, which was just ludicrous. I mean, it's just laughable to watch if it wasn't so painful and real. They're trying to justify the economic disparity that, they want to just make even bigger and increase all the time. And the way in which they do that is by appeasing to the worst aspects of human nature. And so they've done that extremely effectively, sadly. And I think that's the thing. Every time, by having scapegoats, I mean, people like Noam Chomsky talk about this, by having scapegoats, that you can justify almost anything at all.
What message do you think initiatives like that quietly send to immigrants already settled in this country and the children of immigrants already in this country. During the Brexit campaign, the focus on ending freedom of movement felt like a personal snub to me, who used freedom of movement to settle here, like the state in a way regretted inviting me in back then. Do you think immigrants will feel the same thing when, is there a sort of ripple effect to the hostile environment?
Absolutely. I mean, well, right now, if you think about isolation upon isolation, I mean, Brexit was about isolating the country even more, and then we're isolated by lockdown and by COVID, and it's kind of in a way it's kind of allowed this government to bring in more laws that really, I mean, there's no one to check them with what they're doing. This is the thing that shocks me all the time, is that Boris Johnson, with the whole proroguing argument, for example, he undermined the judiciary in this country, and the traditional ways in which the government is checked and balanced by the judiciary, that seems to have gone out the window, because no one seems to have any power, or the opposition, no one seems to have any power to challenge what is overtly unfair, and they can almost say anything. I mean, the fact that you can have a prime minister stand up and be proud of greed and actually proclaim that to everyone, that really says everything about how currently unassailable they are. And that's absolutely terrifying to me.